Okay, good evening. Good evening. That's right, good evening. Good evening. There you go. I want to welcome you all here to Unity Temple. My name is Linda Schuler. I'm the CEO at Housing Forward. This is the third of, and our last for 2025 community event. And so thankful that you decided to come out in this somewhat chilly, brisk weather and join us tonight for this very important conversation. This event is very much aligned with the mission of Housing Forward, as you can imagine. Maria Foscarinis' book, And Housing for All, argues that ending homelessness requires us to recognize housing as a basic human right. In her book, Maria masterfully weaves together personal stories and data, reminding us that behind every statistic is a real person and real lives. It's easy to think about homelessness in terms of numbers and impact and systems, but tonight we really want you to think about the individual people that are impacted by housing instability or homelessness. So at your seats, we have placed some information and would love for you all to take that home and read about Stan. He's an individual that we have served at Housing Forward. I also hope that you leave tonight with a sense of community. That's exactly why we started this series in the first place. Even when we feel that we are living in an environment that is overwhelming and chaotic and maybe things are out of our control, it's a very good reminder to remember that power can be established locally and the power of collaboration as well. So now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Maria Foscarinis has advocated for a federal response to homelessness since the early 1980s, when the crisis was just beginning to explode in the United States. In 1987, she played a pivotal role in advocating for the first and still only major federal legislation addressing homelessness, now known as the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Assistance Act. Maria is also the founder of the National Homelessness Law Center, which has won landmark legal and policy victories, including establishing education rights for homeless children, converting vacant properties to housing, and combating the criminalization of homelessness. She has also helped lay foundation for the recognition of housing as a basic human right in the United States. She has been named a human rights hero by the American Bar Association and is a recipient of the Catherine and George Alexander Law Prize from Santa Clara University School of Law, the John Macy Award from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the Public Interest Law Award from the Public Interest Foundation at Columbia Law School, and a Rockefeller Foundation practitioner residency in Bellagio, Italy. She is also an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School. Esther Young G. Kang is a reporter on the Race, Class, and Communities desk at WBEZ. Prior to arriving at WBEZ, she was breaking news producer, reporter, and editor. For her work, has also appeared on NPR's All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Marketplace, and Here and Now, as well as various newspapers and web publications. So after the conversation, we will have a Q&A, and then after the Q&A, we will be moving over to Unity House, which is just through the foyer, the lobby, for light refreshments and a book signing. Okay, are we ready? Excellent.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm so delighted and excited to be here with Maria. She and I spoke over Zoom, and we had like a pre-conversation, but we will try to, include you guys into that now. And so I want to start, Maria. We had this chat over Zoom, but I want to do this in front of the group. I want to start by getting to know you a little bit. As a reporter and the mother of a privileged only child in Chicago, I often survey people who care about justice, about poverty. How did you end up caring about this? Did you grow up poor? Did you experience this yourself? Did you know people that you cared about that experienced it? Essentially, how did you come to care? And early in the book, you say you grew up relatively privileged in Manhattan. I read in a 1986 New York Times story that you're an only child of middle-class Greek immigrants. You attended some of America's top schools and were even a Wall Street lawyer once. So how did you come to care about this issue?
Well, that's a good question. And I did grow up very privileged. I have not experienced poverty myself. And there's kind of a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is I did, in fact, work at a Wall Street law firm. I admit it. While I was there, I had an opportunity to do pro bono work. And I volunteered for a case representing homeless families who were living out on Long Island, which is an otherwise affluent suburb of New York City. In this case, these families had become homeless. They'd lost their housing, couldn't afford new housing. Housing costs had shot up, and they were without shelter. They sought shelter from the county, and they were denied. So I got involved in representing the families, and it was amazing to travel from my office on Wall Street just a short distance and see this incredible poverty in the midst of wealth. That was shocking. I knew it intellectually, but actually seeing it and experiencing that disconnect made a big impact. The other thing that made an impact was that I could do something about it. As a lawyer, law is a powerful tool. And so I had the experience of working on that case. We had some success. So that's the short answer. That's how I went down this path. I left the law firm. I became an advocate at the national level. I left New York, moved to DC, and started this work. The slightly longer answer is that I am a child of immigrants, and even though we were very fortunate and did not experience poverty, my parents had experienced the Nazi occupation of Greece. And they told stories every night at the dinner table. I heard their stories about what that was like. There was starvation. People were literally starving on the street. And even though there was food, abundant food in the countryside, because of Nazi blockades, it could not reach people in the cities. And so that made, the fact that people suffered and died because of deliberate actions by their fellow human beings just had a powerful impact. So I think, when the case came around, it spoke to me. So I became involved.
Thank you for that. So we will, fast forward a little bit from there to 1987. That was the year that what became known as the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which, as you just heard, is the first significant federal legislation related to homelessness. It was passed by Congress and signed reluctantly by President Ronald Reagan. So tell us a little bit about what the legislation does, some of the components of it.
So this legislation was actually part of a much bigger piece of legislation that I and other advocates had put together to address homelessness. Remember, this was when homelessness was first exploding in the early and mid-'80s. It was a national issue. It was a huge crisis. We had developed something called the Homeless Person Survival Act, which had 3 parts: emergency, prevention, and long-term solutions. What ended up becoming law in the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act was Part 1, the emergency part. So it was funding for emergency shelter primarily. It also created a couple of rights, the right of homeless children to go to school, and it also created this program to use vacant federal properties for shelter and other help for people who are homeless. So that's what it did. Getting it enacted during the Reagan era was extremely difficult. And we had to focus on the emergency part as a matter of sort of political need to get it enacted. But it was not, no one thought that this was going to be the entire solution. It was just a first step.
And so what has been and what continues to be the legacy of that legislation? I mean, it's only as good as, you know, the funding and the enforcement. And so can you talk a little bit about that legacy?
Sure. Well, so the enforcement, we had to file 3 lawsuits within the first few months of the enactment of the legislation because, this was an administration, the president signed the law reluctantly. So this was not an administration that was going to be eagerly implementing the law. So enforcement was difficult and has and continued to be at various times difficult. So being able to use the court systems has been important. Funding has increased significantly over the years, but not nearly to the level that it needed to. I mean, before this legislation, there were enormous cuts that were promoted by President Reagan, enormous cuts to the social safety net. So, this piece of legislation, even though it was so hard to get and so important to get, could not at all make up for all of those cuts.
To kind of backtrack a little bit, as you worked on this legislation, as you are the architect of that legislation, what are some very common myths and misconceptions that were going around about homeless people and homelessness, and things that persist today?
Right. So at the time, Reagan was campaigned for office on a promise to make America great. This was before the again part. It was just make America great. But he also said that he wanted to shrink the federal government. One famous Reagan quote was, "The scariest words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" So it's definitely a focus on cutting government. And he, on homelessness specifically, he said homelessness is a lifestyle choice. People choose to be homeless. That's extremely destructive, and that is something that persists to this day, that somehow this is a personal issue. It's a personal problem. It's not a systemic problem. It's not that there's something wrong with our systems. It's not that we've eviscerated funding for housing, for low-income housing, or other social support programs. It's that, people made wrong choices. It's their problem. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That started then, and it's something that persists to this day, and it's become a bipartisan myth. So this is a myth embraced by Republicans and Democrats alike.
We'll talk about some of the bipartisanship there in a little bit, but throughout your book, you have so many examples of humans, of people who have gone through homelessness, and their stories, like when you read, each person's story, you realize that could be me tomorrow. I mean, that's the sense that I got, at least. I could, experience a layoff. My husband could lose his job. It really could be me tomorrow. Now, we do have a lot of us live with privilege and have a lot of safety, nets around us and things like that. But it all starts with like a health issue, or very often starts with a health issue, or a job loss and things like that. What are misconceptions around mental health or drug use these kinds of things when it comes to homelessness, myths and misconceptions?
Well, there's a big myth that people who are homeless, are primarily mentally ill or abuse drugs or substances. And that's not true. There's a significant minority who have mental health or substance abuse issues, about 25 to 30%, but not by any means the majority. And there's also plenty of people who are not homeless who have those issues too, by the way. We should remember that. And it's a mistake to confuse and to conflate these issues. So it's not to say that mental health concerns are not real or don't play a role, but the underlying cause of homelessness is the lack of affordable housing. And addressing any issues like mental health or substance abuse without that foundation of a stable home will not work. So that's a myth that really distracts us from the real issue and the real solutions also.
So instead of providing the supports, instead of increasing housing, we've seen more criminalization of homelessness. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, the Supreme Court's decision in Grants Pass, Oregon, of course, local ordinances. Can you talk a little bit about the criminalization?
Yes. So criminalization has actually become, over time, has become the dominant response to homelessness. And I think it goes back to the failure to really solve the problem. So, I talked about the McKinney-Vento Act, how the emergency part became law. So that's the emergency shelters. Okay, so we offer emergency shelter. That's important. It can be life-saving. Providing that shelter matters, but it's not going to solve the problem. So to solve the problem, you need housing. And that, if it's just shelter, that means that, it might look as if somebody has done something, but you really haven't solved the problem. So the result is that there are more people, and the causes have not been addressed. So the causes are still there, pushing people out of their homes, and creating, adding to the crisis. So there are more and more people on the street. And especially after the foreclosure crisis and the so-called Great Recession in 2007, 2008, a lot more people became homeless. A lot of people became homeless for the first time. And we started seeing a lot of encampments. So not just people living under bridges, which was been the case for years, but also groups of people living together in encampments. So criminalization really was present from the start. It got a big boost in the 1990s, thanks in large part to former New York City mayor and former lawyer to our current president, Rudy Giuliani. He made a big campaign about cracking down on people experiencing homelessness. And then that sort of it spurred really a lot of cities to do the same thing. And now it's become a bigger and bigger trend. States are passing laws making it a felony to sleep outside. The President of the United States is calling explicitly for the criminalization of people who are homeless. Let's, ship them off to someplace on the, outskirts of cities. So there's been an arc of criminalization, and there were moments when it got better, and advocates were successfully fighting it, but now it's gotten worse.
Over the summer, I covered the story about lessons from D.C. when Trump cleared many of the homeless encampments there, and the D.C. is where you live, and there are, as everybody here knows, a lot of encampments in Chicago and even in Oak Park, other suburbs. What does clearing them actually accomplish?
Nothing. I mean, it actually makes things worse. It makes homelessness worse because when, clearing is a kind of a euphemism. It's when you do that, you destroy people's belongings, what little belongings they have. You expose them to the elements even more because often it means removing people's tents. You often take their personal documents, IDs, birth certificates, things that people need to get any kind of help. Apply for housing, apply for a job, apply for any kind of public benefit. So it just makes it worse and spends money. It's expensive. It costs money to do these sweeps and clearances. And, you're using police, you're using sanitation workers. I mean, police often don't like doing this because they know it's a waste of their time. People then move somewhere else.
So to the end of working toward things that actually work, as I read your book, it was immensely frustrating to read sort of the progress and then the setback and just one step forward, two steps back, kind of on a repeated basis. And I do this a lot, actually don't do this a lot, but in this book, on the margins, I would read something that just made no sense to me, and I would write, "This is stupid." I just say, "Stupid, stupid." There was a lot of that going on because you would see an administration touting that it was eradicating homelessness, and then it would slash funding for housing, or it would fund the program. The data would show that it's working to decrease homelessness. And then when it came time to re-up, they wouldn't do that. So it's just this kind of foolishness that goes on. And so would you speak a little bit to that frustration over the decades of your work?
It is very frustrating because we know what works, and there are examples of programs that work and that solve homelessness. And, it is very frustrating. Has been very frustrating to me to be actually doing this and seeing that we're making an impact, this is working, and then it's not replicated, it's not funded, or it's undermined even. But I know that we have to keep going because we know that these things work, and we're establishing a record that they are working. But we need to do so much more. It is very frustrating. A lot of it has to do with money. I hate to say it. I mean, I have to say, it is resources. It's a question of how we choose as a society to allocate our resources. Right now, we know that at this moment, and it might be about to get a lot worse, but at this moment, only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to be eligible for low-income housing assistance actually get it, because it's not funded. Just because we choose not to fund something that is known to work, 1 in 4. And so, why is that? Because the people who would benefit from this are poor, lacking in influence, and because there are, interests that are well-funded that oppose this. So that's what we're up against. It's not that we can't do it, we can.
We'll talk about some of those interests in a little bit, but I do want to ask you, the story of how the U.S. has failed to address the housing crisis and homelessness isn't just about sort of the big cuts that Reagan made. It's been both parties. And so tell me a little bit about that.
Right. So, so it didn't even start with Reagan. It started actually in the 70s with the loss. It's just when really there was a big loss of low-income housing in the form of SRO housing, single-room occupancy housing. During the 70s, about 1 million units of SRO housing were lost across the country, and that was because of private development. So private developers saw an opportunity to buy this inexpensive housing and convert it into luxury housing. So, okay, that's fine. Maybe the cities look better, but what happened to the people who were living there? Lots of people were displaced. And so then along came Reagan and sort of cut the, that was like the light that ignited the explosion, because then he came and slashed these programs, and he also provided a narrative that made it all okay. So then we have Bill Clinton campaigning on a program to end welfare as we know it. Again, this sort of destructive narrative of the welfare queen. Well, welfare is, people should get off it. It's bad. People should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And, so that, Clinton was a Democrat. So now with criminalization, that's being embraced by both parties. We have Gavin Newsom, who is speaking out as supposedly a very progressive politician, and maybe he is on some issues, but on homelessness, he is calling and he's passing, promoting laws that criminalize homelessness and that cut funding for housing. So it is a bipartisan embrace of a destructive narrative and destructive policies.
Would you talk a little bit about how in 2007, 2008, in 2008 and on, how the Obama administration contributed to the housing crisis we have today?
Yeah, this is a very sad kind of period in the Obama presidency. So, this was in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. A lot of people lost their homes, and many of these homes were insured by the federal government. And so when the foreclosures happened, they became the property of the federal government. They appeared on the books of the U.S. Government, and this was not a good thing. And so the Obama administration saw an opportunity to try to get these off the government's books and deregulated housing finance even further, and encouraged private equity to buy and other institutional investors to buy up these properties. So this has been a growing trend of private equity, large institutional investors who are motivated and whose goal is to make a profit, buying housing and buying residential housing. So that is now a leading cause driving up the cost of housing in this country.
That's an issue that I've been covering a lot of. So we just did a story about the rise of LLCs as owners of Chicago multifamily units and buildings. And, not all LLCs are bad, don't get me wrong. But there's a lot of investors, a lot of corporations that use LLCs to kind of shield them from responsibility. And then using that, they hike up rents, they evict at really high rates, and they milk their properties, essentially. They don't take care of them. A lot of residents have to live in squalid conditions. And so can you talk a little bit about, this trend of investors owning homes and housing? I don't know if anyone here is an investor or a homeowner. You don't have to raise your hand, but would you talk a little bit about that trend and what it does to the housing crisis?
Well, so I want to be clear, I'm not talking about individual homeowners or mom and pop owners of property who rent them out. I'm talking about large institutional investors like Blackstone. I mean, like these large multinational corporations that are really driven solely by profit and are buying real estate and residential properties for the purpose of making a profit. And, this is also related to what's called the financialization of housing, where housing is, sliced up. Interest in mortgages are traded on the stock market. Commodification of housing is another term, where housing is viewed as a commodity for profit. And so this is a dangerous trend, because housing is not just like any other commodity that you try to profit from. Housing is a place where people live. It's essential to human survival. And so housing really is a human right and needs to be treated that way. And right now it's being treated as a commodity and driven by money and driven by profit motive. And it's become increasingly deregulated, so increasingly left up to the private market.
So, to your point about housing as a human right, talk a little bit more about that idea, how you as an advocate and as a legal mind have worked to enshrine that in different places. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
So housing is, in fact, a human right. I didn't know this when I first started working on this issue. It's something I learned about in the mid-90s by going to international conferences and hearing from advocates in other countries about it. But the human right to housing is embedded in basic human rights instruments, which the United States was actually instrumental in drafting and getting adopted by the world community. People don't know this or forget it. But after World War II, there was a big push to make sure that nothing this horrible would ever happen again. And part of that was creating the United Nations and creating these human rights instruments. And a fundamental document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was drafted with U.S. leadership. And it ensures the protection of not just civil and political rights, like the right to vote, for example, but also economic and social rights, like the right to housing, the right to health care, to food, to work that pays a living wage. So, and it views these as together, as inseparable. You can't have one without the other. So, and there are treaties that then in the ensuing years came out of these. So, the U.S. was behind this, and in fact, a year later, in the 1949 Housing Act, set a goal of a decent home for every American family, but it made it a goal. It didn't make it a law. So it just remained a goal. And now, of course, we're very far away from these ideals, but they originate in the United States. This is not something foreign. When I and other advocates, U.S. advocates, became aware of this through international and UN conferences, we thought, well, if housing was a right, this would help a lot in our work. And so we began advocating for it and looking for ways to incorporate it in our work. And we had been making headway with this. In fact, the Biden administration embraced the idea that housing is a right. This came on the heels of the idea that health care is a right, achieved consensus leading up to the Affordable Care Act. And so we thought, this is possible. We could build this consensus for housing as a human right. And at the local level, also, there was some embrace of this. And Biden had even proposed in the Build Back Better legislation expanding funding so that 1 in 4 number I talked about would be covered, so that everybody who was eligible would get housing assistance as a way of actually implementing this idea of housing as a right.
So establishing the idea of housing as a right is important. And then in policy, your book talks a lot about a housing first approach. So can you tell us first what that is?
Okay, so yes, housing first is a programmatic model. It's an approach to addressing homelessness that says to end homelessness, what we need to do first is offer housing, a stable home. And then if people need other services like mental health care or substance abuse treatment, that can come afterwards. The first thing is housing, because without the stability of a safe home, nothing else works. You can't treat mental illness. If somebody's living on a shelter or on the street, you can't, you can, but it's extraordinarily difficult. So housing first means exactly that. Housing comes first. And this is a model that has been implemented around the country and has a lot of data to back it up. It works. It's evidence-based and very successful. It is not funded to scale. This is so typical of how things work in our country. We know that this works. The federal government in the previous administration actually embraced it as federal policy, but the funding remained the same. So we have housing first, but we still have these, McKinney-Vento homeless assistance dollars, the same money, without increasing significantly the money that is put into these programs. We can't bring the program to scale. But so that's what Housing First does.
And how does Housing First give or save the government money? Why is it a good investment?
Well, ending homelessness saves money. Keeping people homeless is very expensive. I mean, and there are studies that show this, that it's more expensive to just allow someone to be homeless than it is to solve the problem through housing. So when someone is homeless, healthcare costs are extremely expensive. Without healthcare, without health insurance, people end up using emergency rooms, very expensive. Police conducting these so-called sweeps, that costs a lot of money. So housing is much less expensive and is a good investment, and it solves the problem. So yes, it makes a lot of sense, and it is a way of operationalizing housing as a human right, if it's funded to scale.
Yeah, so to that point, you say in your book, for Housing First to work, you need enough housing.
Right.
So talk a little bit about what needs to be done to create enough housing.
So I think to create enough housing, that requires a public investment in affordable housing. And it's not going to be enough to leave it to the private market. I suppose it would not be impossible if there was sufficient regulation in the private market, but I think realistically that public investment is needed to ensure sufficient affordable housing that's affordable to extremely poor people. And there's this thing called social housing that is implemented successfully in other countries, and that is not that different from what we call public housing here, but now public housing has gotten such a bad reputation that it's almost, no one even talks about it anymore. That's another example of something that was just deliberately defunded and allowed to fall into terrible disrepair.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that. When the National Public Housing Museum opened just a few months ago, I had the opportunity to interview a number of folks who had grown up in public housing of all different ages. And one woman told me that she grew up in public housing in New York many, many decades ago, and she said that she really felt like the government wanted them to make it. She felt like the government was behind its people and wanted folks to succeed. And we think about what's happening today, and so can you share a little bit about how public housing changed from something that felt supportive and good and positive to what it is now?
Oh, well, that's a big question. Public housing started out as housing for middle class working people. And, how it changed it, I think white flight from cities had something to do with it, and that the population of public housing residents became changed, and racism plays a big role here. So when public housing residents become more members of minority communities, then support for that can diminish, and all of those negative stereotypes get overlaid onto public housing. And then funding for public housing was cut. And so, especially for upkeep, maintenance, repair, security. And so if you strip something of the money that it needs to keep it up, to keep it secure and safe, and then you say, well, it's falling apart, or it's crime-ridden, or whatever, I mean, what do you expect? Of course it turns into something that is not what it was supposed to be.
Here in Chicago, we of course have Mayor Daley's plan for transformation. Talk a little bit about the damage that did for a lot of residents here.
Right. Well, I do include that in the book. There was a big organizing effort by public housing residents at the time to fight back, the Coalition for Public Housing Residents. And the promise was that these public housing units would be destroyed and something better would be built in its place and everybody would get a brand new unit. And that did not happen. It was just like a promise that was broken. And there was no accountability for that either. It was just, it's not happening. So people were displaced. Some people who were displaced became homeless. And that has been documented. That people ended up in shelters.
There's a room at the National Public Housing Museum that kind of tells that story, so I encourage everybody to visit. So I want to talk a little bit about, so who is doing this right, or who is making some strides? Do we all need to move to Finland or Austria? Can you talk a little bit about the examples that you discuss in your book?
Okay, so I'll talk about those, and there are even some local U.S. examples. We don't all have to move. So Finland is a good example of a place that has made enormous strides and is close to ending homelessness. That they say they have ended family homelessness and they're close to ending all forms of homelessness. But Finland has a right to housing in its constitution, and it also puts effort and money into actually backing that up. So there's public investment in housing, what they call it social housing, that is housing that is affordable to very poor people, including homeless people. They have social programs like childcare and healthcare programs. So they have a robust social safety net. And there's also a national ethos that supports this, that thinks this is a good thing, that isn't stigmatizing these efforts. Vienna in Austria also has a very robust social housing program where it's actually, this is a little bit of a different model. It's not limited to poor people. Anybody can live in social housing. And so it's really mixed income housing where people live in it and of all kinds. And it's not stigmatized. And again, it's public investment in this.
I was struck by one particular quote when talking about the difference between U.S. leaders and Finnish leaders' approach to housing. A leader of an organization said, "It is a political understanding and political consensus. This is a national problem that we should solve together. It demands politicians who have an understanding of human dignity." That was the quote.
Right. Yeah, it does. I mean, it demands a very different approach and probably some different politicians. And, again, I think it's possible. And there are some examples. So I'll give a U.S. example as a sign, a ray of hope. So and this is not the only one, but it's a very sort of recent one. In Seattle, there's a group called How's Our Neighbors, or HUN, and they organized a campaign for social housing and for locally funded social housing. So they lobbied for a city agency that would be a city social housing development agency that would be the developer of social housing. And they started from a negative position without support. And they did a lot of public education, organizing, and eventually they got the support they needed. This was enacted. Then they needed to fund it. And this they did by ballot initiative. And again, they started out with the polls against them in a negative position. Again, they did a lot of outreach, organizing, education. And just earlier this year, they won with almost 60% of the vote. So that says to me that this is possible. If people understand the reality, if they understand the facts, they can be persuaded and they can support housing for everybody.
We're going to get to some more rays of hope here in a second, but right now we're in this moment where, funding for HUD has been cut, SNAP benefits are being cut, insurance premiums going up, federal workers laid off, shut down, and I have not even mentioned what's going on in our area here in Chicago with ICE's operations. And so in some sense, like, I read your book and I read about the Reagan era, and I go, well, there's some deja vu there, but then in other ways it feels different and more severe, right? So what do you think we could be seeing here in the coming months and years with unhoused populations?
I think we're in a very dangerous moment. There's no avoiding that conclusion. It's obviously this is a terrible, terrible time, and all of these cuts are going to really affect a lot of people, and I'm afraid we may see another explosion in homelessness. So this is not a good time, and there's also a lot of negative rhetoric. I mean, the other side of this is that people are fighting back, and people are being mobilized or mobilizing themselves. And I think that if there's an opportunity to make common cause across issues and to see that homelessness is not just an isolated thing by itself, it's the tip of a much bigger iceberg, that, sweeping homeless people is just step one. I mean, of losing all, liberties or sense of safety or protection, that this could happen to anyone. 60% of the population is living paycheck to paycheck. Everybody is feeling the effects of skyrocketing housing costs. So there is an opportunity to really fight back and to make common cause across different populations of people.
So then let's talk about what we can all do, if there's anything that we can do. And I recently heard somebody say, don't tell me to call my representative, because I already did that. What are some other courses of action, even if it's in our personal lives with our own finances? Like, I went to a talk by Matthew Desmond, who wrote Evicted and also Poverty, and he has some very practical thoughts on what people can do. And so do you have any ideas for all of us here today?
So I do think it's important to be a voice and to use our voices. And that can mean, calling your representative in government, whoever that is, government at all levels. It can be in Congress, but it can also be at the city level, at the state level. Inform yourself about what is happening at the city and local level, community level. and get involved with organizations like this one who are engaged and who are advocates. I think that's the most important thing that all of us can do, is be advocates. Of course, anyone can volunteer to help in providing services. That's always needed, but I think advocacy is really what we have to do. So, yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of organizations. There are advocacy organizations, there are social justice organizations, there are also mutual aid organizations that provide both services and advocacy to people. So find some of those and get involved with them.
Okay, I think those are my questions. We would love to hear from any of you if you have questions for Maria. So, I think, Libby, you will bring the mic around.
Just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll come around. I'll start right here.
Hi, I work for Age Options, which is the area agency on aging, and coordinate the housing program. And advocacy is such a big deal, but what do we do now? What do we do with these people that can't afford rents that have tripled? Or like what you were talking about with the institutional landlords, where they just want everyone out so they can triple the rent. With SNAP being cut off on November 1st, all these things make perfect sense. But what I'm trying to do to, I don't even know if mobilize my frontline workers, is how do we get people to a place while we're waiting for everything else?
Right. Well, I think, so there are two things, like how to deal right now with people's needs, but also how to try to get out of this situation that we're in. And I know that there is organizing going on with tenants groups, organizing rent strikes, organizing against landlords to make demands. So coming together, creating tenants unions, something akin to labor unions, tenants unions, so people are in a stronger position to counter these institutional landlords. So that's, but what you can do in the meantime, mutual aid, I think, is one approach, and bringing other people from your community into those. There's not an easy answer to these problems. The only answer I know of is organize, demonstrate, mobilize, and educate other people about what is going on. Organize sit-ins. This is a time for action, for being as loud and clear as possible.
Hey, good evening. How are you? I have a question. What do you do, or what happens when you offer help to someone that's unhoused, homeless, but they don't want the help, or they refuse the help?
Well,
Asking them directly, face to face, not through program, not through anything, but like actually walking up to someone that is unhoused, face to face interaction.
yeah.
Do you need this? No, I'm good, thank you.
Well,
What do you do?
you say, you move on. If you offer something to someone and they don't want it, then it's not the thing that's going to help them. Just like any other with anybody else. You, I'm sure, have good intentions. Maybe the thing you're offering is not something that particular person can use, needs, or wants.
Yeah, in my reporting, I've also just, encountered that the things that sometimes people offer are not helpful to folks, and maybe they're being offered, you got to go to this shelter, but the shelter doesn't allow a partner or a pet, or doesn't allow them to bring their belongings. Like, there's a lot of restrictions that prevent folks from wanting to go to those places, or I'm not sure what kind of help you are offering, but there's just a lot of things that, and then for folks to feel like they have some sense of autonomy in moving around and in going to places that even will help them. I feel like that's something that I'm like trying to keep in mind, because it seems simple enough. If you're unhoused, like, just go to a shelter and you can get help if you really want it. And so I think that's what your book talks about, like,
Right.
people kind of assuming that folks want to be outside.
Right. Well, help is not available of that sort on a sort of systemic scale. We know this is a matter of arithmetic. We know there's not enough shelter, just emergency shelter in this country for everybody who needs it. But I understood the question to be about your personal interactions, one-on-one.
And then, for you, since you're both on Wednesday, the anti-camping, like, you can't stop someone camping. Is that you find that helpful, or is that hurtful?
What do you mean you
People, like, you're allowed to camp in Oak Park and in the state of Illinois. So if the person is homeless and they are unhoused and they're camping, they want to camp, I mean, does that help housing, or is it against it? I mean, if the person wants to be out there and they want to be camping and they feel comfortable and safe, is that good or is that bad from a housing perspective?
Well, it's not a good thing for people in the United States of America to be camping. The reason that they're camping is because they don't have a home to live in, right? So that's what's bad. However, if they don't have a home, they should not be criminally punished for being outside or have their tent destroyed and their belongings taken. So, there's...
Well, in the state, it's against the law to arrest them and take them from camping. They can camp. You cannot disturb them. So I'm just saying, is that a means to the end, or is that, like, from a government, from a state government perspective, even a Cook County perspective, does that help in homelessness, or does that just encourage homelessness?
It doesn't, no. I mean, I don't think you can say, I wouldn't worry that it encourages homelessness. Given a choice between a home and camping out, no one's going to choose the camping out. So it's the humane thing to do, not to penalize and to allow people, in the absence of an indoor alternative, to camp outside.
Let me just add to this, because it's a good dialogue, but homelessness is multi-layered. I think we need to acknowledge that. And when you are living on the streets, your mindset is one of survival. And how am I going to get fed tonight? Do I trust this person that's about to approach me and offer me something, and I don't know who this stranger is? I've spent my career in this field, and I live here in Oak Park, and the majority of my career has been with the understanding of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That you need food, you need safe shelter, you need social supports. But when you don't have those things, and maybe you have been traumatized by the system that has not supported you, that safety net has not been there for you, that you are sometimes reluctant to go back into a system that you have been traumatized. So that is all foundational, and that's not restricted to individuals who are living the experience of homelessness. That is for each and every one of us in this room and those that are outside in our community. So I really want to center that as part of our narrative. We always tend to lean into, well, what about the people that don't want this, right? I will tell you that when we went from a PADS shelter model of rotating in this very community, and then we moved to the hotel, the narrative changed for our clients. They're like, well, how do I get into the hotel? How do I get into housing? It wasn't about shelter anymore. It was about, can I have that where I'm in a safe space, even if it's 90 square feet, where I have some privacy, where I can use the bathroom, where I can sleep in on Sunday morning and not have to be forced out into the cold. So that was a little long-winded, and I don't want to, but because there's a lot of that narrative out there about those people that don't want that kind of help that we're trying to offer them. Well, there was another question, Henry. Henry, you're going to talk about inclusionary housing, right?
Well, if you want me to. Well, actually, I am going to talk about inclusionary housing because the model that we've adopted here, Linda and I worked hard to make that happen with people in the community. Unfortunately, we got cut off at the knees, and the model that we have, it provides 10% of housing is required for new buildings. However, you can buy out at the low price of $100,000, and so we have actually out of the something like 2,000 units that have gone up since then. We've gotten 0 new units because it's not funded appropriately. What is your opinion of a well-funded inclusionary housing program where you actually funded at what housing actually costs?
I think inclusionary zoning can be a very viable and good policy. But inclusionary zoning is a funny thing because it can mean a lot of different things. Inclusionary zoning, you're supposed to create certain percentage of affordable housing, but how you define affordable housing really matters. I mean, this is a case where the devil is in the details. Affordability, affordable housing can be defined as 80% of area median income. It can be defined as higher than that. Whereas we're talking about people who are extremely poor. So that means 30% of area median income or less. And that's not typically what's included in inclusionary zoning. And so that's a tricky thing, and it can also be a dangerous thing because it can give the appearance of a policy that creates affordable housing, but that's not the reality. So, and then you add another element in your question about buying out this obligation. So you can buy it out, you can give money, but how much money? Is it enough money to fund the amount of housing? I mean, ultimately it has to be tied to the need. If there's a need for 20,000 units of extremely affordable housing, and you end up with 2,000 units, that's not enough.
Well, we did it wrong here, that's for sure. There are other communities that have done it.
Yeah.
We have great success. In fact, it's talked about, in the book that Matthew does.
Yeah.
About areas in New Jersey where they have and it's provided a lot of affordable housing.
Yeah.
All right, one more question. It's 8:15. One more question. Yeah, Lisa.
It's not really a question, but I had been involved with, not involved, but I did a virtual thing with homelessness some months ago, and I heard about it before. I think there was a program, I'm thinking maybe San Antonio, Texas, and it sounded like it was very successful with.
Houston?
Was it Houston?
Because Houston, Maria references
It was
Houston.
almost like, if I vaguely remember, like almost like mini houses, but it did have the wraparound service, kind of its own little compound. It seemed like it was a very successful model. Have you heard about that, or do you know?
Right. I'm not sure if you're talking about Houston with Housing First or if you're talking about something with tiny homes. I think that was. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was in Texas. There are a lot of tiny home villages in various parts of the country that sometimes are set up so that there's a tiny, tiny home, almost like a shed, but there are services and communal bathrooms and other things like that. What do I think? I think it's probably better than being outside in a tent, but it's not enough. And it's another case where the devil's in the details. It depends on what kind of tiny home. It could be a real tiny home, with a bathroom and a kitchen and a insulation. I mean, it depends on how adequate that tiny home is, whether that's going to work, and if there's services.
Could be a stepping stone to something bigger, but it seemed like it was successful in the people that were talking about it, because they were showing people in San Francisco, like, homeless advocates, and their homes were failing.
Right, it can be a stepping stone, but you've got to make sure you've got the other stone there, and often we end up just with a stepping stone, and then you kind of step off a cliff after that, and you don't do the other parts. So that's the other thing I would be worried about.
And the other thing I want to add is that there's a lot of like creative solutions to let's build tiny homes, let's create, there's so many ideas out there. But the fact of the matter is there are landlords in Chicago and the suburbs that are keeping their units, their homes vacant. There are actual homes that are empty for a reason. They want to keep the rent low, or they want to wait until a better opportunity. This is happening, and there's algorithms right now. There are programs. AI is helping to do this, to create models that say, you know what, don't rent it out. Keep your units empty. So there's housing available for sure. Yes, on a bigger scale, government could create more housing, public housing for the poorest, but there are so many homes that are empty, and more and more will be, because people will be evicted. And I'm writing a story about that right now, and so I don't know. I'm sorry. I just
Well, that's a really good point, because there is housing, and it's not affordable housing, and often it's empty housing that's simply functioning as an investment vehicle for these private equity, for foreign investors. It's housing as investment. And so how do you address that? Well, you can address. I mean, you need regulation. You're not allowed to have an empty unit for over a certain amount of time. As if there's a housing crisis, an affordability crisis, there are models for that. But you're absolutely right. It's not simply, it's often said, well, we need to build more housing, or even it's just because there's so many regulations we can't build more housing. Well, that's really not a true narrative either. It's what type of housing, and how do we make sure it's affordable and that people can actually use it.
All right, with that, let's give Maria and Esther a round of applause. And thank you all for being here. Dandelion Bookstore is with us tonight, and they have books, and Maria's going to do some signing, and stick around and have conversations. So we encourage you to meet us in the back. Thank you all again for being here. That's great. Thank you so much.